Clearly?
Yes,
All
please.
right. And the slides are visible? Okay. So let me start off. Now, the outline of session is like this. I will talk about why publish, what to publish, where to publish and present, and little bit on author visibility and authentication. Uh, then Dr. Vijayalakshmi will talk about writing the manuscript and, as I said, specifically about original article and case report. Okay, so in where to publish and present, I will also a little bit touch on the journals and especially about predatory journals and predatory conferences, because many people uh, sometimes do not have much idea. So I think that's something important, and that's why I'm touching on that. Now I think many of the people will believe that this has become important, writing and publishing, but could I get some responses in the chat saying that what are the reasons for them to publish, or what do you think this publication is all about? Can some people respond in the chat, and then so we can quickly have a view? Okay, so ma'am says to let the research community know of the work that we have done. Vinita ma'am, share research knowledge. Seema Chavan, novel findings, visibility, share knowledge. Okay, if your work is not published, you have not done the work. Okay, something like new scientific ideas. Okay, yes, academic growth, Jaswinder ma'am. Yes, share research finding. Okay, Shalini. So right, and mandatory requirement of regulatory body. I was wondering why it has not come. Yes, so Dr. Pratik says mandatory requirement. Completes the research process with visibility. Agreed. Evidence based practice. CV, enrich the CV. Yes, share our experiences. Increase collaboration, promotion, of course. So you have covered almost everything. Yes. So you're right. Uh, now, as you rightly said, that these are the reasons for us to publish. So there are many. Of course, you have said it all, and I think some of those have been captured here. Why is this like? Yeah. So of course, it gives us fame. It gives us recognition among our peers. And somebody has rightly said regulatory requirement. Now most of the regulatory bodies have said that for a particular level, if you're an assistant professor, to go to associate, you need that many numbers. You need professor promotion, you need that many. Some places they get incentives, and universities, institutions have incentives because they also in turn get benefited by visibility, by rankings and things like that. So that's there. Many a times this helps us in getting grants and research funding. So grant application gets importance if I have certain research publication. Sometimes some people believe it's their responsibility. If I publish, it's my responsibility to society. Or if I've used a funded research from a particular government organization or something like so taxpayers money, so I'm using that, so I have to finally give back something. Or many people believe it's contribution to progress. So all these are there. And many a times people publish because they are also forced to, or sometimes they don't have a choice. And nowadays, in fact, postgraduates are also being made to at least send a manuscript for publication, if not totally publish. And again, depending on universities, some universities insist that they also should publish. Other than that, let me also tell you, there are a lot of other things. Now I'm just showing you some of these just published articles. So if you see Kaisanur forest disease, one of the disease which is actually prevalent in certain parts of Karnataka. So this particular disease, actually, when they first time saw in Kerala and somebody's published it. So that's also something like a case report kind of a thing. Again, you're sharing knowledge. Again, if you see, I have taken a particular example of Kaisanur forest disease just to show you. Now in this particular thing, there's a publication from my own university. It's from speech and hearing department. Now if you see here, they talk about something different here, and they talk about neurological symptoms of that. And they've talked about how this particular disease presented at viral encephalopathy and meningoencephalitis and things like that. And they say that previous literature review did not show any language deficit signs, but then they found this in one of the child, and then they said like how this child had this, all these things, and how they went about and how they actually made it to improve. So again, this is something which again shares the experience, so it helps in improving. Now if I have to like look at the example currently, coronavirus, we are still in the dark, we are groping in the dark about so many things, including sometimes even the presentations or even treatment. People say hydroxychloroquine, and we are still not having enough evidence. Why? Because we've not had enough published reports, we've not had enough of experience sharing, we do not know what exactly works, and we've not gone about scientific research because it's too new, one, and not many people have been able to gather so much data to publish. But we have started seeing some publications coming out, and that's how people have started applying some of these things, at least in some way. Similarly, sometimes we want to implement a program, and then if you look at the people's behavior. So if you look at this paper, inter-district variation in child health promotion practices, and we did it between two districts in South Indian state in Karnataka, and that gives us an idea why certain parameters are better and why people are behaving in a particular way, and what services we need to provide to them so that we can have these health indicators and health of the people which becomes better. So again, that also is important. Similarly, we tried out something different. This is again one of our publications which came in a very highly impact journal, a good journal for malaria research. So this again is talking about something related to technology. We talked about tabs, which these were given to the health workers who went around and then entered data and things like that, and uploaded geotag pictures of surveillance and things like that. So we reported that. Now this helps in, again, one, disseminating what we are doing, also getting some kind of a peer review. Third thing, also trying to replicate this in some other places and all. So this again helps. So these are some of the examples I just wanted to say. So it gives us an idea why publishing is important. Now, types of scientific papers, I think most of the people here in the audience know it. Just for completion's sake, let me quickly run through it. Original article, that's based on original research, or you're doing it some first hand and then you publish that as a full paper. Then there is case report, and these two have been kept in on top because today these are the two things which we will usually discuss. Now please remember, case report usually of a single report, but a single case, but many times it can be two cases also, but usually single case. And you see and you find something different, something unusual which has not been seen, or which can lead to some kind of a new knowledge or some kind of a discussion which will build on the people's understanding, or say maybe diagnostic potential or something like that. So that is again important. Then there is review. Now a particular topic, you can do a detailed analysis of published literature, things like that, and go in depth of that, and you come out with a synthesized review where you say these are the things or aspect. You can have a very you know uh, small aspect which you take, or you can have a broader view, but then it's a very in-depth, and you go through lots of things and then you come out with a review. So then you will give all the guidelines. Many times these guidelines are also like that, which come like that. Or sometimes it's a particular disease and you're talking only about a particular parameter, like diagnostics of a particular disease, or it could be treatment parameter of a particular disease. So that can also be done. Then commentary is there, short article with author's personal opinions. So that kind of thing. There are short articles or brief papers which are obviously in brief. Then there are technical notes. A specific technique or a procedure is described, and that comes there in technical notes. I have just listed most common ones. There could be more other things as well. Then there is a pictorial essay, and many times it's used in certain sciences, including ophthalmology and things like that, where they say with pictures. So lots of pictures and images, and then you have a few things to go with, and then a few explanations. So teaching article kind of a thing with images, which projects the whole thing in a concise way, but at the same time, very nicely, where the author is projecting his views, or authors are projecting, and the reader will comprehend it better because it's supported by images. At the same time, we also have editorials, and most times these are written by the editors, but sometimes you have an invited editorial where a subject expert is asked to come and share the views. And the letter to editor. Now, letter to editor is usually written in response to a published paper. So many a times we read something, we have certain views. It can be sometimes supporting, sometimes supplementing, or sometimes even contradicting the views or trying to clarify certain things. So we can write letter to the editor. And when we do that, we are trying to again build on that knowledge or improve science, or further the scientific knowledge. So that also helps. But there are also occasions when certain journals, very high prestigious journals, will take your original research article and also publish it as a letter to editor. At that time, they will probably say, you condense your whole work, and you can do it with, say, limited number of one figure, or maybe one table, or one table, one figure, and certain number of references only. Now that again depends on the author or authors, whether they want to go ahead with that publication as a letter to editor, or they want to try some other journal and go for a full publication like a original article. So these are some of the things I've told you. Now, where do we publish? Having said, so many a times we are in a dilemma. There are so many paths, so many things leading to different places, different journals, different venues. We get confused. But please remember, when we start off, at least two things we should have in mind, or maybe three. That is a backup plan. So what we should do is, when we start to think of publishing, we should keep in mind at least two or maybe three journals. So I would suggest that have a list of them, priority wise. So you identify the journals based on their merits, demerits, list out that in a tabular form, columns, and then you put it, and then decide based on those parameters where you want to actually publish. So it will always be that, so that once in case it is rejected from a particular journal, the first submission, you don't have to again start from the scratch and start looking for a journal. So you have a second option, and then you have a third option at least. So that's what I mean to say. Always have a plan B. If it doesn't work out in one this thing, so have a plan B. Now, what are the basic things which you should look for journal in a journal? So which audience is right for me? Where do you read papers related to the research that you've done? Which journals publish the type of article that I want to write? So these are some of the considerations. Then among those journals, if I shortlist a couple of them, what journal do you think I prefer when it comes to the kind of articles that I'm planning to submit? Then if I have taken a particular work and done that, where are my references usually published? So again, I should look at that. And what do my peers suggest? Why that is in blue? Because many a times my peers may not have an idea. For example, those who are inexperienced, or my postgraduate colleagues and all, they may not have an idea. So that's why it's in blue. So it need not be that always I go by that. In that case, I should take advice from a particular senior colleague or somebody who knows about the publication process, or I should do my search, and then I will tell you a few more things what to look for. When we evaluate the target journal, we should look at the prestige of the journal. What is the standing of that journal in the scientific world, or my particular community? So if I'm from a particular specialty like ENT, or say ophthalmology, or community medicine, or say medicine, where does that journal stand? What is the kind of the uh, respect that journal commands? Then what is the speed of publication? And many of the journals, good journals, give you from time from submission to time to first decision, time from decision to publication. So that's always there. So you can look at that. And if you think that you need to consider this, then that's also important for you. Look at some journals which will do it promptly. I'm not saying that in 2 days, 5 days, or 1 week. That I'll come to in some time, but a reasonable frame of time. Then what is the target audience of that particular journal? We need to look at, because if I'm targeting people in a particular specialty, I cannot go and publish in some other specialty, or I cannot publish it in, say, a very general journal, because then my target audience is totally different. Though people might reach that by searching it, but then my target audience may not really always reach that. So there is a chance of people in my specialty missing out on that paper. Then the aesthetics of that particular journal. Then what has been the author service experience that you or probably somebody else has had with that particular journal and the publication house. And then very importantly nowadays, cost. What is the cost factor involved? So if it's affordable or not, because many of the journals now have become paid journals, or they charge you for service. Sometimes they charge you even for submission or peer review, or sometimes there are certain clauses like, if you have a particular figure in color, if you want to reproduce, they'll charge you, things like that. Then again, you need to look at likelihood of acceptance. Another thing is, many of the journals will also give you what is the acceptance rate. Good journals give you that. You need to check their website, and then you will find out that, or in their author submission modules, they will be there. So we need to select our journal carefully, read the aims and scope, because many a times the journal rejects it by saying it's out of the scope of this journal. And why that happens? Because people have not really read that journal scope and gone about submitting it. So that's another thing. Then obviously think about the target audience and the level of your work. Do you have a chance of getting accepted? Because if it doesn't match, again, you know so of course it comes better with experience, but you can always evaluate, and you can take help from the senior peers as well. Follow the guidelines. That's again very important. We'll touch upon this more in the next webinar, but again, that's very important. It should be as per what the instructions say, and we should be very careful about that. And they should not be submitted to more than one article, one journal at a time. Again, we'll touch more on this in the next one when we talk about publication ethics. Then some word about predatory journals. Now these journals are mushrooming, as you said, that that's become a regulatory requirement. It's also about promotions, it's about incentives, it's about a lot of things. So what has happened is there has been a mushrooming. In fact, if any of us want to start a journal, we can start it probably in a couple of hours or maybe a day or two. So we can start a website, we can, and people will submit. We can even charge a fee and people will pay. But that's all gullible people. All seasoned researchers now know that they have to submit work and get published in a good quality journal which has visibility and which honors good quality research. So we understand that there are some journals which are known as predatory. Why predatory? Because they are waiting to capture those people who are gullible and extract from them, one, their work, the other thing, their you know uh, money. So what is the harm done? The harm done is basically the research goes in for poor credibility. It hardly gets cited, so it's a waste of kind of time, resources, everything. The third thing what also happens is you end up getting poor kind of uh, reputation. And once that happens, the person as well as the institution, and many times there are repercussions on the universities with these credibility going down. And nowadays even lay press has published articles saying about predatory journals and things like that. So that's the thing about predatory journals. So the idea is they aim to make money. They will give you, unsolicited mails, flood you with that, and say, promise things like publication in 2 days, 5 days, 1 week, and things like that. And you submit and you'll get, sometimes they will even have, for eyewash, they will have a peer review and things like that. But basically if you look at their quality, you will be able to see that many a times they don't even bother what they're publishing, and the formatting and everything is in doubt. uh, One particular person who came up with this whole thing and publicized it was Jeffrey Beal, who's a librarian at University of Colorado in Denver in US. So his thing came up as Beal's list, which is available. In between, it was taken off because of a lot of threat, and then he went underground and things like that. But again, it's available in many other places, so you can check out, and he updates it regularly. Now, how do you identify predatory journals? You can identify by looking at the contact details of publisher. Many a times they don't have a telephone, email, and post. It's very poorly put, and many of these are running like from one room or so. Many places, even in India and sometimes in China, they are running lots of these journals from one room, sometimes 12, 15, 20, 25 of them. Then there may not be peer review process proper. Then it's not well indexed, it's not in quality indexing systems, and many a times they don't really give you a proper you know explanation for why they are charging the fee. Then editorial board. Now here I will mention with caution, sometimes you will find lots of people who are actually there in the editorial board of the journal website, or pictures are there, but actually those people sometimes themselves may not be aware. It's happened even with me. when there was a journal which put me up, and then I didn't even know that I happened to be in their editorial board. So it can actually happen. So don't go by that. If you happen to recognize any of them, you might even contact them to find out if you have a doubt. The other thing is, are they having any kind of, say, recognized initiative membership? So like, committee on publication ethics, DOAJ, or say OASPA, all these things, because that means they are credible. So to sum up, predatory journals are basically unsolicited. Many a times they have misleading names like British Journal of, American Journal of, but they will be based somewhere else. And then they offer fast publication, hardly any peer review, poorly indexed, charge enormous fees, and may even provide you options for fast tracking, or sometimes some other services for which they charge. A little thing about predatory conferences: similarly, these conferences are held just to make money, and for that to authenticate, you can look at certain things which I'm giving you just tips. Are you aware of the society or the association which is organizing the conference? Can you easily identify the venue of the conference? I will tell you of some times when we had this experience with some of my colleagues. They actually were on the way to attend the conference, and then in transit when they reached Mumbai, and then they got a call that there is no conference there. It's also happened with two of my colleagues when they were going abroad, and once they landed they realized that there was no conference there. So these are predatory conferences. Sometimes you might also get that yes, there is a conference, and people have started after those experiences calling the hotel venue or something, saying that is there a particular conference being held, is there a booking for that conference? So that's one of the things. Sometimes you may have a conference, but when you land up there you will find only a couple of handful people, 20, 25, 30, 50 people, and it's an international conference. So you need to verify the veracity of the organization. The other thing, have your colleagues or known people attended this conference before, and what has been their feedback? Are the registration charges disproportionate to the conference? And is it clear what are they charging you for? Are they waiving your fee for if you're a speaker? Are any sponsors involved? And do you read any papers of this conference in a proceedings? Then also, is there a timeline? Is there a scope or objective of the conference which fits in the core interest of yours? Is there an editorial committee? And have you heard of these committee members before? Are they people of good standing? So all these things. And then is there a peer review, and then there is editorial control? So you need to look at that. Then just to give you some publishing tips and quickly give you some ideas, and then give you some brief about visibility of authors. Publishing tips, please remember, now with so many journals, so many papers coming out every day, even in good quality journals, editors and reviewers as always have been looking for original and innovative research, or something which is different from what is already there. So that's important. You need to give that. The other thing, you need to have enough numbers to justify your statistical conclusion if you're doing original research. So please remember that, and we'll touch more on this even in ethical issues next week. Next webinar on Thursday. Then if you have a larger study, please think of having a comprehensive paper rather than slicing it and making it a salami paper, and thinking that okay, we will have bifurcation and trifurcation and whatnot. A few tips: when you want to write better, first thing, you need to read, because the more I read, I get familiarized. And read with the objective of getting familiarized with the style of writing, style of uh, in that particular journal, and of that particular topic or the kind of work that you've done. Build capacity and gain knowledge. You can do that by attending workshops, online courses, and there are so many of them now. Some of them are free, some of them are charged, but I think you can think of doing, and then also get experienced by doing practice and collaborate and network. Because many a times some things are my strength, I can do the work, I can do lab experiments, but I'm not good at writing. Collaborate with people with complementary strengths, and then be perseverant, because one thing that you require is being perseverant for publication. Please remember a few things: it should be clear, avoiding any unnecessary details. It should be very simple, impartial, which Dr. Vijayalakshmi will give you details about. It should be structured logically. It should be accurate, not vague or ambiguous, and it should be very objective so that you support everything with evidence. So please remember, scientific communication demands precision, and I need to demonstrate that in my manuscript. It demands clarity and it demands economy. I cannot have pages and pages. So I need to have that brevity. Just a few things about, so this is one of these good resources, International Committee of Medical Journal Editors website, ICMJE, which gives you authors guidelines and so many other things. So please remember this and access this. And a few things about visibility. Last webinar also somebody had asked about ORCID. Please remember, this is one of the things which helps us to identify ourselves, especially when there could be a likelihood of confusion. So you can have your own author details, and then you can have a unique ID for yourself, which will be, for you. And the moment you mention this, many of the journals have started asking you to put that ORCID ID for yourself. Then the other thing is Scopus. Now, please remember, if you publish any paper in a journal which is indexed in Scopus, automatically you will have a Scopus author ID, which will be linked to your papers published. Now, what is the advantage? The advantage is that you will have everything there, and you will have citations, H-index, everything put up there. Then you can always look at that, and then you can know where it is, where you stand with compared to other peers and things like that, and you will get the idea of all the papers in one place. So this also improves your visibility. This also helps you to merge your authors different names and profiles to create one. Now, one word of caution: when you are publishing, please try to keep your name the same way in all the papers, because the moment I start changing, or say for example, if I were to write Animesh Jain, Animesh Kumar Jain, A Jain, that all becomes different, and many times it becomes into a different profile. Of course I can merge it, but that is a little tedious and sometimes it's not really warranted. So I would suggest that use same kind of or one name every time. And if you see here, ORCID ID is linked to my Scopus ID. The other thing is a pure portal. This is a Elsevier initiative. Uh, our university has got a license for this and they've subscribed to this. So this again helps you to connect with other people. So you have a profile there and it will talk about, what the citations, H-index and output, what has been and all that. It also gives you your collaborators' names and, in a very nice diagram kind of thing. It also gives you what have been your, so in the under the fingerprint, what have been your different subjects, and you can sort it by weight or alphabetically. Here I've shown you the weight. So what are the different topics you work on, or the subjects you work on, and people can find you. And similarly it goes for, like, the publications that you have, that will also give you how many have tweeted, how many have cited and things like that. So it's a very nice thing to, like, again, for people who want to connect with you and network. And it also gives me my connections who I have collaborated with and worked with. So a map kind of connection. So that's there. The other thing is Google Scholar. Now I would suggest that you should have a Google Scholar profile. And if you look at it here, if I can show you, so here basically what happens is, if you actually can verify your thing. So if you look at this, I have verified my email ID by going to a particular process where actually it helps me to verify my email ID on my institutional domain. So once I do that, it becomes a verified profile. So that's again important, because then it becomes authenticated. Not that without this you can't have, but this becomes a much better, and functionality increases. The other thing I want to talk about is, many of the people here would be doing their reviews. They will be contributing. Now there is something known as Publons. For those who do not know about it, some people might be knowing it. So there's a website called Publons, and now it's with connected to Web of Science, Elsevier, and things like that. So if you see Publons, EndNote, Web of Science, everything is what with one mail ID. Now they have interconnection. So if you log into it, your profile will show about you and how many manuscripts you've reviewed, and you see Web of Science ID is also integrated. So basically it puts at one place all the reviews and all the contributions you've done, including your papers, your editorial positions, anything. So again, it's a good thing to do. And many a times some of the journals look at this, your interest, your publications, your reviews, and then they will also send papers based on this to you for reviews. So this is a good visibility way again. Then there is something known as ResearchGate, which I'm sure that many of you know about. This also is in a way to give you visibility. You can even connect with people, you can have discussions, you can even list your papers and everything. You can even request for people to give you their full text, or people can request you, they can text you as an inbox and communicate and a lot of things. So again, this is a good idea to actually have a profile on ResearchGate. So you can have a profile on ResearchGate as well. So these are some of the things I thought I will share so that you have a perspective about these things. Now I will hand it over to Dr. Vijayalakshmi, who will take you through the whole process of writing a manuscript. So we'll take the questions at the end as usual. So over to you, Dr. Vijayalakshmi.
Ma'am, you have to unmute yourself, ma'am. Hello.
Yeah, I'm having some issue with my screen share. I'll start it again. Yeah, just a minute. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Animesh, and a very good evening to everyone. So to quickly rewind through what we went through over the last 6 webinars, we started with identifying a problem, then framing a research question. We went through the steps of literature review. We went through formulating research objectives, designing the research and the various research methods. We went through tools of data collection, and then we went through the ethical clearance process. We addressed various ethical issues in research, including informed consent and the institutional ethics committee. And then we also went into how the data can be analyzed. Now we are coming towards the end of the whole process, but it is not the end. It is just a beginning. How we are going to publish what we have worked on so far. So this session is essentially about writing a research paper. The objectives of this session are to outline the characteristics of scientific writing, describe the elements of a research paper, discuss the structure and method or style of writing each element of the original research paper, outline the components of a case report and discuss the method of writing a case report, and also to outline the criteria for authorship as per ICMJE guidelines. Now, Dr. Animesh has already gone through this, and he's told you that there are various types of scientific articles like original research, review articles, case reports, technical reports, data papers, conference proceedings, etc. This presentation will focus on the original research paper and case reports. So although Animesh has already dealt with the characteristics of scientific writing, I will quickly run through it. Scientific writing should be clear, and it avoids all kinds of unnecessary detail. It should not use any vague or complicated sentences, and it should use direct language. So it should be simple, and it should be devoid of any sort of technical terms or jargon. Technical terms should be used only when they are absolutely necessary for accuracy. Now, it should be neutral. That is, we should not make any assumptions, such as I can say, everyone knows, everyone in this group knows how to write a scientific paper, right? It's an assumption. And I cannot say it can never be proved that nobody in this group knows to write a scientific paper. So we can't make assumptions and we can't make unproven statements while writing a scientific paper. The scientific paper should present how and where the data were collected, and it should support its conclusions with evidence. It should be structured logically in the sense that the ideas and processes need to be expressed in a sequential and logical order. The text has to be divided into sections with clear headings. The paper should avoid any kind of ambiguity, and particularly in the language, we should not use words such as about, approximately. So there should be nothing vague, so it should be accurate. Now it should be objective. Statements and ideas in a scientific paper are supported by appropriate evidence that demonstrates how conclusions have been drawn, as well as it should acknowledge the work of others. Actually, acknowledging the work of people who have contributed not directly but indirectly into the scientific paper, who may not be part of the research work that is being done. Actually, it tells us, it displays the integrity of the authors or the researchers. So to summarize the characteristics of scientific writing, it should be clear, simple, neutral, structured logically, it should be accurate and objective. Now, what is an original research paper? An original research article is a primary source of scientific literature, and this article presents an original study. So the authors have to conduct the research on a particular topic through a series of experiments, surveys, observations, and report the findings of their study through these original research articles. Now, what does this original research article do? It introduces an original research idea, reports a new discovery, shares new findings, establishes older findings, proposes a new theory, or sheds new light on an already explored topic. Now let us go through the anatomy of the original research article. So all of you will be familiar with the IMRAD format. So that is what we are going to discuss now. The original research article has a title which is followed by an abstract or a summary. And then we have the introduction, methods, results, and discussion which constitute this IMRAD. This is followed by references and anything else that has been used in the study, such as a questionnaire, should be appended. So why is this IMRAD structure given? So when we write the introduction, it answers the question why. Methodology answers when, where, how much. Results answers what, and the discussion answers so what. So the way forward from there will be able to be communicated by the discussion, and hence the discussion is the very important part of an original article. The title should have as few words as possible, and these words should describe the contents of the paper. It should be understandable, informative, and specific, and it should be really concise. If a paper is not titled properly, it will never be read. So we should make an attempt to give a catchy title so that it creates a sense of curiosity in the minds of the reader. Now, how to write a title? We need to make a list of the most important keywords that are going to be part of that paper and think of a title that contains these words. We could also state the conclusion of the paper in the title. Next, after the title comes the abstract. Now, abstracts are of two types. They could be structured abstracts or it could be just a lay abstract. Usually, original research articles require a structured abstract. So abstracts should be clear, and it should also be written in simple words, and it should be like as if it is the uh, uh, not the researcher reading, like a lay person reading it. Somebody who doesn't know anything about the particular research study that has been undertaken is reading it. So it should be that simple, because most of us, we first read only the abstract, and only if the abstract is understood, we go ahead and read the rest of the paper. So the abstract should provide a complete and a selective summary of the most significant ideas and information. It should describe the methods that were used in the study. It should summarize the results and state the key conclusions of the research study. Now, most journals demand that an abstract should not exceed 250 words. It should be written in one paragraph. Long words should be followed by an abbreviation. For example, if we use chronic suppurative otitis media, we should write CSOM in parenthesis, and throughout the paper, we should use the abbreviated form of it. It should never give any information or conclusion that is not stated in the paper. Now here you see an abstract of a case series. This is not an original research paper. This is a case series and a literature review. And here we have written a structured abstract. Just a few lines have been written in the beginning to give an introduction, and then we have written written the objectives of that particular paper in a line, followed by the materials and methods, and the study design, the result, followed by a conclusion. So this is another abstract of an original research paper. There is a background, and then a methods written, then the results, conclusion, and then the keywords are written. So this is how a structured abstract is written. Now, what constitutes the introduction of the original research paper? The introduction informs the reader of the relevance of the work, and it includes a relevant background, the basis on which the study has been done. It should provide a clear statement of the rationale for approach to the problem that has been studied. And it should also outline the key objectives of the research. The introduction has a funnel-like organization wherein we should start from the known area, proceed to the unknown area, that is that particular topic that is being studied, and then come to the research question. The research question has to be made obvious in the introduction. So that is why that particular study has been done. So the abstract which I showed previously had studied vestibular dysfunction in type 2 diabetes mellitus. So when we write an introduction, we start something about diabetes mellitus, the prevalence of diabetes mellitus in the world, and probably how much of vestibular dysfunction has been so far reported, or whether it is whether vestibular dysfunction has not been reported at all in diabetes mellitus. And then you come to an unknown area saying that vestibular evoked myogenic potentials have not been used to study vestibular dysfunction in diabetes mellitus. And so this study is being done to assess vestibular dysfunction in diabetes type 2 diabetes mellitus using vestibular evoked myogenic potentials. So that is how an introduction is written. Then we should state the objectives. So while stating the objectives, we should use words like to determine whether, the purpose of this study was to, this study tested the hypothesis that, this study was undertaken to. So the purpose of the study is also stated in the introduction. And we come to the M section, the method section of the original research paper, wherein we need to detail how the study was carried out. Detail, but then we need to be precise. It has to be written completely and concisely. We should not include any information that is not required. So only relevant information has to be written in the methods section, and all the experimental procedures that have been used in the study have to be detailed. We should answer all questions such as how or how much. Like, how did you study? or how much of this particular thing was studied, it should be answered in the methods section, and it should not be left as a puzzle for the reader. All the analytical techniques, Praveen had done a wonderful session on data analysis. So all the analytical techniques that you use in that particular research study have to be explained in the methods section. Now the results constitutes the heart of the paper, because it is through the results that we explain the new knowledge that the research has contributed to the world. And so the results have to be explicitly stated and in simple way. So while writing the results, we should summarize and illustrate the findings in an orderly and logical sequence without interpretation. So the results should guide the reader through the findings and emphasize on the major points of the study. Now, tables and figures are the foundation of the story that is being written. So if they are standalone itself, the tables and figures should be able to communicate the result. So the reader, when we have written our results in the form of tables and figures, there should be no need for the reader to refer back once he or she has gone through the tables and figures. So the tables and figures are very important while communicating the results. Now, when do we use a table? When do we use a graph or a figure? And when do we use a text? So when we have to show many and precise numerical values and other specific data in a small space, to compare and contrast data values or characteristics among related items with several shared characteristics or variables, or to show the presence or absence of specific characteristics, we should use a table. To show a trend, pattern, or relationships across and between data sets, figures are used. To summarize research results, we can use a figure. To present the visual explanation of a sequence of events or procedures, geographical features, or physical characteristics, we can use a figure. So you may be going through the news every day. There is a visual explanation of the growth of the COVID pandemic in the form of a graph, and there is a comparison across countries, across states, across cities. You can see the comparison. So to show the trend, we can use a figure. When we don't have extensive data that is complicated to present, we need to write it in text. So while putting the data into a table, that is, if the table has got only 2 or few columns, then it need not be written in a table. We can put it in text. When the data that we are proposing to present is peripheral to the study findings, then we can write it in text. Praveen had already taught the anatomy of the table. So if you look at here, I think all of you will be able to make out clearly what are the components of a table. So there should be a legend, that is a table number and a legend for that table. Each column should have a title, and then you have a table body, and then you have the footnotes, and the lines, there should be lines to demarcate different parts of the table. Now here you see another table. So you're seeing the legend, then you're seeing the columns that are named, and then you're seeing the body of the table, the footnote, and also there is a citation. So when you are referring to a table from some other article, when you have taken that and written it in this article, you need to also cite the source. Now, if tables and figures present repetitive information, we should combine such tables. Now, when we are presenting large amounts of information, the data should be divided into clear and appropriate categories, and they should be presented in columns titled accurately and descriptively. Tables should be organized in a logical sequence. While tables present results, graphs promote understanding of the results and suggest the interpretations of their meanings and relationships. So graphs should be used when we want to make the reader understand the relationship between two variables. So what are the commonly used type of graphs? Line graphs help in showing trends, how the data changes over time, or the relationships between two variables. So bar charts are used when we want to compare discrete items. The bars we use can be either vertical or horizontal, and we can give different colors to the bar so that the reader can differentiate between each result. Now, when do we use pie charts? When we want to show the proportion of the whole that is taken by various parts, pie charts are used. Now, whenever we use a figure, we should ensure that the image is clear, and there should be legends to explain the key, and all important parts of that graph should be labeled. Now, we should avoid representing the same data in the form of tables and as well as figures. So if the data has already been represented clearly in the form of a table, we should not repeat it in the form of a graph. Now, when do we use drawings and photographs? As clinicians, very often we use clinical images or intraoperative photographs, postoperative photographs, preoperative photographs. So they are used to reinforce or supplement textual information, and they give more clarity. Now, when we want to give a diagrammatic representation of something, we can draw a diagram. Now, photographs also help to explain what is being discussed in the text. So whenever we use a drawing or a photograph or a diagram, we should explain clearly what it is, whether it is a histopathological micro photograph, or whether it is a radiographic image. So if it is a radiographic image, we should specify the details. If it's a clinical image, when was it taken during the course of the disease? Was it post-operative or whether it was intraoperative? So we need to describe that particular image that we are using in simple terms, and these also have to be numbered. So the guidelines for the use of photographs: the picture has to be cropped to a suitable shape for the journal's column dimensions without reduction in size, and we should retain the highest possible resolution. The key to the photograph has to be included in the legend, and you should group any related figures into a single plate so that it can fill an entire printed page rather than it be scattered throughout the publication. Now, coming to the discussion, it's the toughest part of writing an article. In the first paragraph of the discussion, we should write what did the study, that is the study that was undertaken, show, and did it address the aims stated in the introduction. In the second paragraph, we should describe the strengths and weaknesses of the methods employed in that study. In the subsequent paragraphs, we should discuss how the results support the current literature or refute the current knowledge on what has been studied. In the last paragraph should be giving future directions. So what, where next, the way forward, or what would be the impact of that study on the current thinking or practice. So that is how a discussion is essentially written. Now, in the discussion, I quote, say what your findings mean, not what you would like them to mean or think they ought to mean. Say what your findings mean, not what you would like them to mean or think they ought to mean. So in the discussion, we have to reiterate our main findings in the context of furthering knowledge or impacting patient care, public health, policy or future research clearly. We have to be very honest about the limitations of the study and how the findings will fit in with the established knowledge. If there have been any inconsistencies, we have to explain. And the discussion has to be focused and written succinctly. Why do we need to do referencing? To support opinion, to add credibility to the information that is presented, and to enable the reader to trace the source that is being used, and to avoid possible accusations of plagiarism. Referencing is very important. Now we need to include a reference for all the sources of information that are used when writing. So when we use another person's work in our own work, either by referring to their ideas or by direct quotation, we must acknowledge this in the text of the work. And this acknowledgement is called a citation. The reference list contains the books, articles, and web pages that are cited in the text of the document. Any paper not cited in the text should not be included. The reference lists will help readers to investigate the subject in greater depth. Now, we already discussed how to do the referencing, and we had also shared the Vancouver's referencing guide for your use. So that is listed again, how to cite and how to do the referencing. The reference guide, most original articles we have, they demand that the referencing is done in Vancouver style. What are the rules for effective writing? Let us quickly run through this. We should use concrete rather than vague language, active voice wherever possible. For example, Smith et al. Investigated the relationship between, that is active voice. The relationship was investigated by Smith et al. That is confusing. That should be avoided. We should avoid using there is, there are, it is, it was, etc. There should be, we should not use two negatives in a particular sentence. Common everyday words should be used rather than obscure or complex words. The first and last sentences of a paragraph should match, that is, should be alignment. They should be they should be in alignment, they should be related to each other, and not, there should be no disconnect. Omit all the needless words, use short, simple sentences. Don't overdo by using but and, but or and when starting the sentence. Always try to put the words that relate to one another as close together as possible. Now, what are the rules for using numbers in the text of your article? Whenever we have a number less than 10, it should be written in words. If the number is 10 or more, it should be written in numbers. However, we cannot start a sentence with a number. If we have to start a number with a sentence with a number, it should be written in words. Say 35 people participated in this study. Then 35 cannot be written as 35, but has to be written as 35 in words. Now we should be consistent in the list of numbers. Whenever we write a number less than 1, it should begin with a 0. So we can't write 0.5, we have to write 0.5. If you are writing 10%, then after 10, there should be no space before we write the percent sign. Now let us look at this. The decision for surgical management requires certain prerequisites. One of the most important is the determination of stage of disease by pathological examination of a tissue sample, which remains the gold standard to evaluate the stage of disease. So can you tell me what is the problem with this? Or has it been written well? Is it conveying the message well? Is it clear? I'm not able to see the chat box. Can somebody help me with that? If you can see the chat box, please read what people are telling you.
Yes, just have. So passive voice, too long, not precise, too long again, ambiguous. Citation is written wrongly. Message is not clear. It's not clear and not and can be concise.
Yeah.
It's long and confusing.
Vague.
Lacks punctuation. Readers get lost and lacks brevity.
Exactly. Even the person who wrote it wouldn't have understood what he or she is trying to convey when he reads it back again. So let us look at this. The same thing is rewritten. Determining the stage of disease is essential for considering surgery as a treatment option. Sorry, there's a mistake there. Histopathological examination of tissue sample is the gold standard method to ascertain the stage of the disease. Is this better? Please omit that word management. It has come by mistake there. Determining the stage of disease is essential. The same thing has been rewritten in a different way. Determining the stage of disease is essential for considering surgery as a treatment option. Histopathological examination of tissue sample is the gold standard method to ascertain the stage of disease. So, Dr. Animesh, what are the responses for this?
Full stop before the citation, superscript, or after somebody's asking, but interesting to read it now. Much better.
Okay.
Yes, clear.
Okay. So this is what I was trying to convey by saying that the sentences should be simple. The same message was conveyed by the previous sentence also, but it was made so complex by joining too many things, and uh, finally the what was it became incomprehensible, right? So what I have written below is also we can work on it, and still it can be made into a better readable, better understandable form. For reporting numbers, we are continuing there. We need to use one space between a number and its unit. So suppose you're writing 2 centimeters. After 2, we have to use a space and then write the centimeters. Percentages should be reported only to one decimal place if the sample size is larger than 100. Do not use decimal place if the sample size is less than 100. Do not use percentage if the sample size is less than 20. For ranges, use 2 or a comma, but not dash to avoid confusion with that minus sign. Now, the rules for data numbers do not apply to citations to the literature. Now, let's go into tenses in the scientific article. Abstract refers to unpublished results and hence it should be in past tense. Introduction gives the background information or accepted facts and hence should be in present tense. When you're reporting any research, it should be in present perfect tense. That is, previous studies which have evaluated the effects of vestibular dysfunction on diabetes mellitus have whatever they have reported. So that is how you need to write it. Now, when you write the methods, because it is describing what was done, you need to write it in past tense. Results, again, it's past tense because you obtained the result. And when you're referring to a table, graph, or a figure, we should use the present tense. Discussion, when you're discussing the significance of results, we need to use present tense. Past tense to summarize the findings and present tense to interpret the results. For conclusion, a combination of tenses needs to be used to highlight the past research and future directions. Example, although the study found evidence of vestibular dysfunction in diabetes mellitus using vestibular evoked myogenic potentials. Further studies, you can say that further studies are therefore necessary to determine the effect of whatever. Okay, so that is how we need to use a combination of tenses in the conclusion. Now let's go on into the case report. How do we write a case report? Now this is a case report published in the American Journal of Dermatopathology. It was one of the first published accounts of what is now called AIDS. Now when you look at the types of scientific publications, the case report, people say case report has the least value, but it's not so. The case report is also as equally important as a systematic review or a meta-analysis or a original research. So what is a case report? It is a description of important scientific observations that are missed or undetectable in clinical trials, and they aim to convey a clinical message. So they are scientific observations that are carefully documented so that they may be a valuable education and research resource. Now, what kind of cases should we report? Can we report every case that we see in the hospital? We can't. We need to choose specific kind of cases to report. So cases which have a unique and unusual presentation, or those which illustrate a new principle or theory, cases which raise questions regarding the current theory or practice, when there is an adverse response to any treatment, such cases we need to report. When there is an unusual combination of conditions or events that cause confusion, and cases which have had a deep personal impact either for the patient or for the treating team. Before writing the case report, we need to identify the journal, review the instructions for authors, read several case reports, and take signed informed consent of the patient. Whenever we use any images of the patient, we should ensure that all identifiable information of the patient is de-identified. That is, it has to be concealed. But if we need to use photographs, such as ENT people, we may be using pictures of the face, facial trauma particularly, or when we do facial plastic procedures, we may have to show pictures involving the face. In such situations, explicit consent has to be sought from the patient, and the consent form should detail what kind of disclosure will be made through the particular photograph. So prior permission has to be taken from the patient whenever we use any image pertaining to the particular patient. A case report has a structure. It has an abstract, introduction, and then the description of the case, the literature review, which is usually brief, and then the discussion followed by the conclusions and the recommendations. Here is an abstract of a case of rhinoscleroma, a clinical mimicker of malignancy. So the abstract is so small, it is less than, it's actually only about 55 words. So when we read the abstract, we can quickly scan through the content of the paper. This is another abstract of a case report of lung involvement in childhood onset granulomatosis with polyangiitis. Now this is a structured abstract used in a case report. So the first part conveys the objective of publishing that objective, the intent of writing, reporting that case, the typical clinical features, then the intervention and the outcome, and then a conclusion. That is what it adds to the existing knowledge on that particular disease. So the introduction in a case report should be concise, and it should attract the attention and interest of the reader. The introduction should provide background information on why the case is worth reading and publishing. and it should provide an explanation of the focus of the case report. When we write an introduction, we should explain the merits of the case report in the light of previous literature, and a focused comprehensive literature review should be done to corroborate the author's claim in that particular section. Now, this is the introduction written in that same paper. So when you see, the first part of the introduction is talking about the causative organism for rhinoscleroma, and then that the organism has low infectivity and which parts of the world it is endemic, and there are sporadic cases. And then it talks about the prevalence, and then what contributes, the factors that are responsible to the prevalence, and what are the sites of involvement of rhinoscleroma. It has been outlined in percentages. Then the last line says, the present case had a mass lesion that involved the upper lip, nasal cavity, and palatal areas, causing airway obstruction, raising clinical suspicion of malignancy. So it clearly indicates the intent for reporting that particular case. So what happened was, there was a brief overview of the problem. There was a little bit of literature that was reviewed with citations. And then the closing sentence was about the case being reported and the intention of reporting that particular case. After the introduction comes the case report or the case summary. So here, this summary of the patient, summary is drawn from the patient's records, and it describes the relevant case history in a chronological order. Also the clinical examination findings, laboratory reports, imaging reports, pathology histopath reports, and all other essential information that is necessary to highlight the striking features of that particular case have to be detailed in the case report. Then this should be followed by the treatment outcomes, the treatment given, the outcomes, and the follow-up of the case. Then it should include the images which demonstrate the striking features of that particular case. Now, the discussion is the most important section of the case report. In the discussion, we should summarize and interpret the key findings of the case report, and then contrast what has been described in that particular case report with what is already known in the literature, thereby justify the uniqueness of that particular case that is being reported. Now, from this case report, we should also be able to explain what new knowledge and applicability to practice was derived, and if we could draw any clinically useful conclusions. Finally, a concise statement of the lesson to be learned from the case with justifiable evidence-based recommendations for future practice has to be made in the discussion. References for a case report should be carefully chosen by virtue of relevance, and they should support the specific points that were highlighted, and it should provide additional information to the reader. Now, coming to authorship, Dr. Animesh already mentioned that you should go through the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, ICMJE guidelines. So, who can author? Authorship is a great responsibility, and it also gives credit to the people who author. We talked about visibility as well. So ICMJE has given updated versions for uniform requirements for manuscripts submitted to biomedical journals. Now, based on these guidelines, who can get the credit for authorship? One who has made substantial contributions to conception and design or acquisition of data or analysis and interpretation of data, drafting the article or revising it critically for important intellectual content, final approval of the version to be published, and who gives agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work in ensuring that questions related to the accuracy or integrity of any part of the work are appropriately investigated and resolved. So you know, not only need to contribute to the conception and design, or you have to contribute to drafting the article or revision of the article, and also once the manuscript is given, final approval has to be given for the version that is to be published. Apart from all this, an agreement for accountability has to be given. Only then one can be a author. All other contributors who have not done 1, 2, 3, 4 will not be given authorship credit, but will be recognized in the acknowledgements section. Acquisition of funding, collection of data, or general supervision of the research group alone does not justify authorship. It does not qualify for authorship. When a large multi-center group has conducted the work, the group should identify the individuals who accept direct responsibility for the manuscript. Each author should have participated sufficiently in the work to take public responsibility for appropriate portions of the content. The order of authorship, who becomes the first author, who becomes the second author, who becomes the third author, the order of authorship should be a joint decision of the co-authors. Usually it is decided at the start of the study itself. Authors should be prepared to explain the order in which authors are listed. In the sense, why somebody is listed as the first author, why somebody is listed as the last author, or why somebody is listed as the third author. The group of authors, the team of authors should be prepared to explain the reasons for listing of the authors in that particular order. So once we have finished writing the manuscript, whether it is an original report, case report, or any other article, it goes through a peer review process. Here, the corresponding author will submit it to the editorial office along with the permission, that is copyright transfer and permission to use the copyright material, to the editorial office of that particular journal. The editorial office will transmit it to the editor, who will share it with reviewers. Usually 2 blinded reviews are done for most manuscripts. Once the reviewers give their recommendation, it comes back to the editor, and then the editor gives the decision. The decision may be to accept the article, or the editor may send it back to the corresponding author for minor revisions or major revisions, or outright reject. So the article which is accepted goes for publication. So this is the peer review process. So these are the references that I used for my presentation today. With that, we come to an end of the basics of publication part 1 of this series of webinars. The next series is very interesting. It will be, the next webinar is on publication ethics and authorship issues. Thank you very much. We'll be taking questions now.
Dr. Vijayalakshmi, thank you. I have got 1 or 2 questions which I have jotted from the chat. So one was regarding the title. So any guidelines or any word limit for the title?
Yeah, usually they say it should be 25 to 30 words, but we need to go through the author instructions of each journal.
Right.
Long titles usually do not become, they become redundant, because it's not possible to read and understand what that article is going to convey when we have a very long article, a long title.
Okay, so one more is, what type of abstract is good for a review article?
I would suggest, in my experience, even for the review article, I have written structured abstracts only. But then for a review article also, you can just, if it's a history article, say a medical you can write a lay abstract, which is just communicating what is being, why the review is being done, and for what is going to be communicated by that review.
Okay, then somebody has asked about methodology. So how should be the method section on a review article be written? There's a question from Nisha Jain. So
Yeah, usually when you you review certain databases, right? It could be a Medline search or it could be a Cochrane review. So from which year to which year did you review the databases, and what are the databases that you review that particular method, and what kind of search did you perform? What was the search term you used? All that can be outlined.
right. Then somebody has asked about, though not very connected with this, but how can we get access to latest Scopus listed journals if your library does not have any accessibility? You want to take that, or you want me to answer that?
I think you should be answering that.
Okay,
Because,
so basically, see, there are multiple ways. You can, some of the simple and easy and economical ways I can talk about is that basically what you can do is you can have access to some libraries where people are, and they can have access to that article, so have friends there. The other thing is librarians have a connection with other libraries, and they have a mechanism to get articles from other places. Third thing is, there are some places, including I can tell you that QMed KF, QMed Knowledge Foundation, they can actually get articles for you, of course, for a fee, but very reasonable fee. So Miss Vasumati Sri Ganesh, she is based out of Mumbai, in Andheri in Mumbai. So she can actually get articles. She has connections from all over the world. And believe me, I have also tried that. So she's a personal friend, but I have used her service, and then she has been able to get me an article in a couple of hours from the US. And that was an article which was actually not available in soft copy form, which is actually scanned from a library in the US and delivered. So there are multiple ways, and some of the journals also have this facility. And of course, there are other ways which I don't want to like go on record. But there are,
Another
There is
another
yes,
option is Delnet. Another option is
of course,
Delnet.
those
Actually, we
libraries.
just have to give them the courier
Yes,
charges and photocopy charges. They send it across.
right.
there's another question on what is the impact factor of a journal.
Okay, so that's a good question. Impact factor of the journal basically refers to, I'll just very simply tell you, basically what they do is for a particular journal. Okay, now if you take all the articles, that is like, you take only certain types of articles, you don't take certain other kinds, like, letter to editor short and all that. So you take only those articles, and then for all the citations it has received for the past 2 years, divided by the number of articles published, and as I said, only qualifying articles. So that will give you an idea about what is the impact factor. Now basically, for this official impact factor, the journal should be indexed in Science Citation Index, SCI. There are so many other agencies, impact factor services, this, that, so many. All those are not really counted as impact factor. If you want a particular, authentic impact factor, it should be from the Thomson Reuters Science Citation, Science, SCI, that is. So that only will give you the impact factor which is authentic. So please remember that. Again, this is a way where they say that these journals have a very high impact, because the journal which publishes such articles, there is a high likelihood of citations in that journal. Again, does not imply that every article in that journal will be cited. In fact, because of that, a lot of things like site score and site factor and all that have come in now, which take into account a particular article's citations. There was another question. Somebody asked, Josmita has asked, PhD studies will be published in parts. Is this allowed, or is it like salami slicing? So again, I
We're
did,
dealing with that
yeah,
next.
yeah, we will. But just to quickly tell you, as long as it does not really mean that you have tried to cut it into such small pieces that it loses its meaning or impact, it would not be. But please attend the next webinar on Thursday. We will be dealing with these things and publication ethics and things like that. Dr. Vijay, this is question difference between references and bibliography, though I have covered it earlier, but if you want to, you could just take that.
Actually, bibliography is just listing of all the sources that you have referred to while preparing your article or your presentation. Referencing means it should be written in a particular format and it should be cited in the body of that particular article. And if you say, if I go to reference number 1, it should correspond. So it should be listed in that particular order. I think during that review of literature session, you were explained to how to cite and the chronological order that you have to
That's what I
use
said.
in
I've
the.
already, yeah, I've already done that. There's also a query about DOI, and I think there was a query I saw. There is DOI twice. It has come. So
Yeah,
DOI
it's
as
been
well as
answered.
one.
Yeah, digital. What is DOI? That is the
Yeah.
question.
So DOI is nothing but digital object
Digital
identifier. DOI. Now you would have seen that many a times there is a particular thing now given. So with a number DOI dot something and 10x into or bar something. So basically, what it does is something like, if I want to go to a particular site website, I have a particular URL, unique resource locator, or a website address. Similarly, DOI, if I take that and paste it, I will reach that article
Hello.
directly. So that's a digital object
Good evening.
identifier, DOI. So that's what is DOI. And there was a question, if I can't find it right now, DOI versus something, it was asked. What is DOI and DOI compared with something else?
Yeah, that's
PubMed ID.
PubMed ID.
PubMed.
Okay, so PubMed ID is
PubMed.
basically any article which gets listed in PubMed. So that will have a ID which is there. Usually there is, like earlier it used to be National Library of Medicine, and now again PubMed. So PMID is there. So PMID is basically when that guy gets listed in the PubMed, there is, in that database you have a number, unique number, which is there for that particular. So based on that you can actually locate that. So PMID is different from DOI. DOI will take you directly to that particular article on the web.
Okay, I saw a question from someone. They've asked, lately we see articles like report of a case and review of literature. So which category does that come under? See, if that person has done a systematic review, I showed one article on Ortner's syndrome case series and literature review, which we have published. That went into the category of systematic review because we have done a systematic review. If you have just done a literature review just like that for the sake of publishing that particular case report and you're talking about it, then it goes under case report category.
Okay. There is another question, though it doesn't totally concern here, but there is somebody asking it repeatedly, that as a reviewer, how many comments you are allowed. I don't think there's a specific answer anybody can give to that, including Praveen, who's also one of the editors, because it's the prerogative of the reviewer. The other thing, there will be usually a structure, but you can always, if you find that there are quite a few things to comment on, please go ahead and comment. And because you are just trying to improve the quality of that paper and you're trying to make it better. The idea is, if I'm doing a good job as a reviewer, then definitely the quality of the final output will definitely improve. Or even if it gets rejected, and if somebody as an author takes it in a positive way and improves that paper, because I have done that, and then many a times my paper after rejections and comments has improved really from where I started. Praveen, you would like to add something on that, being an editor?
No, absolutely say the same thing I wanted to share, because some people write two line reviews to 10 pages review. So it all
Yes.
whatever review we give, that review should be authentic one, and it should not
Absolutely.
hurt somebody's feelings. And at the end of the day, it should be encouraging. Usually we expect the positive kind of reviews, with positive comments from the authors.
Or
That makes more
constructive
sense.
criticism, where like
Constructive
you can actually,
criticism.
yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
So you can do something from that. Yes.
There's
Right.
one more question. If we have modified and used a standard questionnaire, that is already validated questionnaire, if we have modified it to the needs, and can we give reference to the standard questionnaire? Yes, you have to definitely. You have to cite it also that you modified this and why you modified it. You have to justify that also.
Yes. There is another question. I think I'll take 2-3 together. One is about identifying index journals, which I think Praveen has already answered, one or two. The other thing is about, some of these journals misleading about impact factor and how to identify the authentic journals and things like that. So basically, you need to look at these databases, credible databases like PubMed or Scopus. because these are the credible databases. And for a journal to get listed in one of these, it's not easy. I'll tell you, one of the journals I know of was trying for it, and once they could not get into Scopus, the Scopus puts, like, say, for example, I have a journal which has been running for 3 years, 5 years, or 7 years, or 10 years, and I want to get it indexed in Scopus. So I need to fulfill certain criteria and then apply for Scopus indexing. So they will evaluate my journal. Now, once they do that, they will decide whether to include or not. And Scopus is so stringent that they put a moratorium of that you can't even reapply for indexing for next 5 years. So imagine. Not only that, many of those journals, I don't want to name them, but there are some journals which have come out from India as well, which were till recently, and one I know where it was recently till December 2019, it was indexed with Scopus, but it has gone out of Scopus after being there for 7 or 9 years. There are some other ones also, and because of their dubious practices, including practices like publishing a high volume of articles in one issue with a lot of those peer review related issues, as well as charging money exorbitantly and things like that, all the issues combined. It's not that you can't charge money. There are ways of having open access and then reasonable charges, but what the issue is, the quality, and then a good peer review system. So those things have led them to go out of Scopus and even sometimes losing PubMed indexing. So you need to look at those and then not get fooled by, because many of the journals will claim, but you need to know about these. And that's why I gave you just a brief idea how to identify predatory journals. What other questions? Any other questions that I have missed out on? Praveen, Dr. Vijayalakshmi.
There's one question on H index.
H index. Okay. So basically that's about the authors. So H index basically refers to like authors, and if I remember correctly, Praveen, correct me if I'm wrong. Basically, that's about how many of your articles have that number of citations. So basically, that gives me so if I have a H index for suppose of 20, that means 20 of my papers have at least 20 citations. So that's how it is.
Yes.
So basically, it keeps increasing as you go forward in your career, and then you have, or even if sometimes you have published articles which have a very high citation rate, so then automatically it goes up. So that's something which is again related to the author's credibility. And again, H index is different for Google Scholar, and if you see H index for Scopus, because Google Scholar, again, it's a good thing in a way because it takes into account all the publications and the citations, including smaller and not indexed in Scopus and PubMed maybe. But the thing is that at the same time it sometimes inflates it. So you need to take both in that stride. It also gives you an idea about how many citations each publication has. So in a way, it's good, but I'm not saying that you should go only by that. You should have both taken into account. I think that's about anything that's missed out.
Sir, one question from my side.
Yes, please tell.
Yeah, I mean, what is the language that is standard across all the journals? Is it English, American English, or British English?
Okay, good question, Dr. Sriharsha. Depends. Most of the journals will use, depends on their origin again. And many of the journals are very specific. Good that you brought up. I have seen, they say that the English, I've seen some of the instructions to authors. I don't have it off the hand reference right now, but they say that we use American English. So in that case, we need to use American English because, as I said, some of the journals are very particular, especially those journals which have a very high rejection rate because they have very high submission rate as well, or maybe the frequency is very high. So they usually will reject even if we don't follow certain small thing guidelines like this. But again, it takes precedence when the science is really good and some small minor things like this. So they might even consider it. But generally, if they have to reject because they think that it's a mediocre paper and has not followed guidelines, what also happens is they get an impression that if you're not meticulous to go through the author's instructions and not follow that, probably you've not been meticulous in your research as well. And your analysis and interpretation may not be meticulous. I'm not saying that's true assumption, but many a times they go by that. And since they have a high volume of submissions, and they have also restrictions of space, and also they have volumes coming out, say monthly or bi-monthly or sometimes quarterly, so they will reject high numbers, and that's also in a way where they keep up their high standards.
Sriharsha, let me share my experience in this. We had submitted an article to the archives of the Archives of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery, that is published by the American Medical Association. And that's one of the front runner journals in ENT, if you know.
Yes.
I had written that article in British English, and I had submitted it knowing fully well that the journal is American. It did not go beyond the editorial office itself. The office assistant quickly wrote back a mail to me that that they would only go make the changes to suit to their language requirements. And then I said, no, don't make the changes yourself. You send it to me and specify your requirements. I will do the changes. So the editorial office assistants are quite quick in requesting for language corrections if it doesn't conform to their requirements.
Actually, nowadays, even some of the Indian journals are asking for American English. That is surprising.
It is better to
That's
look
true.
at the instructions to author section of the journal, where they would have actually mentioned which type of English they are expecting. I think we can write our manuscript accordingly rather than having a conflict with them. It is better to follow their instructions and do accordingly.
Yes.
Very
Okay.
true. Even the formatting requirements, the
Everything
spacing,
will be
they are different in few journals. So you
I
have
think
to follow that.
one last question I'll take before, I think, because it's already 9:40. So there is somebody is asking which is a good journal to publish. Is it online or published in print journal? Or I think depends. I would not say that go for one particular this thing, because if you think that some journals are good, if they are well indexed, if they have quality publications, go for that. Also look at certain other things which I have suggested already, including the cost and readership and things. But please be aware, as of now, at least in India, our experience is that the regulatory bodies are very stringent about certain things. So if you're looking at that point of view, please ensure that you have reached that particular level what you're required to, and then. But I would suggest that PLOS, BMC Group, all these are online journals but have excellent quality. So please ensure that you know what is your aim, and then accordingly go for that. So I think that should be right.
Yeah.
So Dr. Sriharshak, shall we close?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, once again, and Dr. Vijayalakshmi ma'am for an excellent talk on basics of publication part 1. We again meet on next Thursday.
On Thursday.
Basics, and again on June 8th we have our additional topic, which is qualitative research by Dr. Praveen Kulkarni, sir.
Yes. Yes.
With this, we end the webinar for today.
Thank
you
you
very
so
much,
much.
Sriharsha.
Thank you so
Good
much,
night.
everyone. Yeah, thank you.